We are very pleased this evening to have one of BC's most distinguished faculty members to talk about a new book. Tom O'Connor is an example to all of us who would like to write new books for many years. And to introduce Tom, I'd like to introduce his colleague and former student, so he'd better be nice, Professor Jim O'Toole of our history department. Jim.
Well, good evening. How does one introduce Tom O'Connor to an audience at Boston College? This would seem to be a superfluous or even foolish task, and it would be if it weren't such a pleasant one. Tom has been a part of this academic community virtually his entire adult life. He first enrolled here as an undergraduate, taking time out to serve in the United States Army during the Second World War, and then returning to graduate with the class of 1949. Classes are still in session, apparently. As a historian, Tom, I think probably won't be surprised that some wise guy would go back and find an archival source about him during his undergraduate years, and that's just what I did by looking up his graduation yearbook. This is a cheap trick, I know, but his biography in the 1949 Subturi read as follows. A graduate of the Boston Public Latin School, upon arriving at Boston College, Tom chose history as his major with a minor in economics. A veteran with 3 years service in the Army, Tom is a gay bachelor. Oh, how the meaning of some words has changed over time. Planning graduate work in history. Blessed with his well-displayed natural talent for drawing, in addition to his scholarly achievements in history, he will undoubtedly soon be giving illustrated lectures at some well-known university. How fortunate we have been that ours has been that university. Receiving his undergraduate and master's degrees from BC here, and then while finishing his doctorate at Boston University, Tom joined the faculty in 1950. Since then, several generations of students have had the benefit and the pleasure of studying history with him. All the while, he gave more than his fair share of service to the university as chairman of the history department from 1962 to 70, as faculty assistant to the president, 1970 to 72, and in countless other capacities. Those accomplishments would have been career enough for some, but while he was doing all that, Tom also maintained an active career of research and writing. His scholarly interests and lively literary style have made him the unchallenged dean of Boston historians. He's the author of a dozen major books. It's easy to throw off a word like dozen, but think about what that takes. And these have appeared like clockwork, especially in the last 20 years. Rigorous and analytical, these books have brought the insights of history to a wide public audience. And in that connection, I have to mention the Emmy Award that he won for Boston the Way It Was, that series for public television. He is the only member of the history department who ever has, and I suspect ever will, win an Emmy Award. His most recent book is The Athens of America, just published by the University of Massachusetts Press, about which he'll speak tonight. As a former student and current colleague, I can't begin to express the pleasure I have in asking you to join me in welcoming Tom O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Jim. Oh, when you go back to look at somebody's yearbook, I mean, that's good. Thank you all for coming and joining us this evening. It's a delight to see so many faces, many of whom I know, and some of whom I'll know a little bit later in the evening. And thank you for joining me and maybe listening to some of my personal reflections on what I consider to be a very, very fascinating period in Boston history. Maybe this is one of the values of teaching core courses, these general courses. You know, we all like to specialize. And like everyone else, I specialized in the age of Jackson and the Civil War. But on the other hand, I always taught, and I enjoyed teaching these general histories, history of the United States and so forth, which often brings us into periods that we otherwise really wouldn't see much of. And so for year after year, I sort of glanced over this particular period in American history and in Boston history. And lately had some chance to go back and look a little more closely. And it's very fascinating. And so in this time of reflection, let me have you reflect for a minute. Imagine now what it would be like if you were a son or a daughter, a grandson or a granddaughter of one of those very famous Boston families in colonial times, whose members had rebelled against British authority, who had composed the Declaration of Independence, won their independence at overwhelming odds, and then went on to write the Constitution of the United States, and then hand over to a new generation, your generation, the American Republic. Now I ask you, imagine if you were a member of that new generation. What do you do as an encore? Huh? What can you do with this priceless jewel that has just been handed to you? How can you make it gleam even more brightly? Okay, you have your cherished city on a hill, as John Winthrop so eloquently phrased it. What do you do with it? What should this city look like? How can it possibly be any different than any other city in this new republic? So different, in fact, that again, in Winthrop's eyes, the eyes of the world will be upon it. It is, at least I think, this sense of obligation to history, and at times this challenge for tomorrow, that I think gave the members of this post-constitutional generation their unusual drive and their determination to make their Boston not only a great city, but also one that would serve as a model for all other American cities, much as ancient Athens had done when it was the cradle of civilization centuries earlier. As a result of this drive, this determination, the 20 years that I've looked at in this book, roughly from 1825 to 1845, saw in Boston more significant, and I would suggest even revolutionary changes and reforms than at almost any other time in the nation's history. And it was due in large part to the concerted efforts and intelligent organization of many prominent Bostonians who had become wealthy and successful in a wide range of business enterprises, and who formed what I've called a leadership elite that has seldom been emulated in this or in any other American city. These people would make Boston a veritable Athens, the Athens of America, to put on display for every American to see what a leadership of well-born, well-educated, and socially responsive elite could accomplish. After Boston had been transformed from a town to a city back in 1822, it was under the direction of its second mayor, a man by the name of Josiah Quincy, that the first major steps were taken to renew and to restore and to renovate the old town of Boston, which was already 200 years old at the time. Under Mr. Quincy's vigorous and often tough-minded leadership, Boston became one of the cleanest and best regulated cities in America. But it should be noted that Mayor Quincy did this not only for his comfort and that of the other, quote, more fortunate residents of the city, but also for the members of what he called the less fortunate classes. Those people, as he put it, who had to stay in Boston during the long, hot summer months and inhale what he called the noxious effluvia. He was a Harvard man. Yeah. We would say the awful smells that resulted from low tides and dirty streets and uncollected garbage. And it was by no means a coincidence that when a little later on he had a new market building constructed behind Faneuil Hall. The architect he chose, a man by the name of Alexander Paris, provided the city with its finest example of Greek Revival architecture, with porticos at the end of each of the buildings, and then 4 massive Doric columns supporting a simple pediment. The next time you go down to the Quincy Market, you're looking at a Greek temple. And not by accident. Well, Mayor Quincy's Boston, Mayor Quincy became known later as the Great Mayor. And there is a tribute to him downtown, very close to Quincy Market. Mayor Quincy's Boston may have been the cleanest city in America. He made sure it was. He used to weigh the amount of dirt that was collected, so we would know exactly what was going on. It may have been the cleanest, but it was by no means the healthiest. And it was in this regard that the influence of the more fortunate classes became even more evident. A little further back in 1810, while Boston was still a town, a young doctor, a physician, by the name of John Collins Warren, whose relative had fallen at the Battle of Bunker Hill. John Collins Warren saw the desperate need for a hospital in the Boston community. They had doctors, but they had no place to practice. And he felt, of course, that this was a great need. So Dr. Warren and young friends of his went around collecting money from those wealthy members of the town whom he referred to as the treasurers of God's bounty. Very interesting phrase. In history books, we hear about it later on in the 19th century being referred to as the stewardship of wealth. But it appeared here even earlier, the treasurers of God's bounty, and therefore they must put their attention to this. Well, the leading citizens responded with great enthusiasm, but of course, more to the point, with their money. They not only supplied the money, the funds, for what became the Massachusetts General Hospital, which was to treat patients with physical ills, and for the future McLean Asylum, to treat the mentally ill, but these people also assumed personal responsibility for the direction of these institutions. It was not merely a question of the check is in the mail. For many years, wealthy merchants and businessmen, most of the members of a group known as the Boston Associates, served regularly as hospital trustees, as well as continuing to make substantial financial contributions to those hospitals. What has always struck me as significant about this enterprise was the word general. For this hospital was not to be reserved for the rich and the famous, but available to members of Boston's general population. This particular characteristic of improving conditions of the poor, making the city better for all of its inhabitants, I found to be a key element in most of the social and intellectual reform activities that took place in Boston during the early part of the 19th century. A revision of the poor laws during this period of time, for example, was designed to improve the lot of the helpless and the homeless, the so-called impotent poor, those who could not help themselves, while on the other hand providing work in institutions that now became known as the houses of industry for those who are able-bodied but unemployed. At the same time, a temperance movement supported by political leaders, by physicians at the Harvard Medical School, and by an increasing number of religious organizations set out to liberate unfortunate individuals from the curse of alcoholism that they felt wrecked individuals, destroyed families, and yes, impeded the new industrial system. It was one thing to get drunk on the farm. How much damage could you do? But in some of the new factories, with some of the new machineries, it could be deadly. The men, and yes, an increasing number of women, who served on the various prison discipline societies during exactly the same period of time, worked not only to improve the deplorable conditions of the prisons, but also sought new ways of returning prisoners to normal society, changing things. These same Boston reformers also separated juvenile offenders from seasoned criminals by sending them to what they called the House of Reformation. Many of us would later on remember these as reform schools. But I think the House of Reformation had a much more Protestant tinge to it. But that was the intent of this House of Reformation, to reform, where these juvenile offenders would receive various forms of occupational training, an early version of rehabilitation. That word was not used during this period of time, but that obviously was what was meant. Now, developing organized reform movements to save citizens of Boston from poverty, from homelessness, from intemperate drinking, from disease, all of these things were obviously well and good. But more than anything else, the leaders of Boston were also intent on raising the level of their minds, as well as improving their bodies, and opening their imaginations to the possibilities of the future. In Europe, during this period of time, cities like London and Paris and Vienna were celebrated for their royal courts and their fashionable salons, where members of the so-called intelligentsia would meet and would form exclusive societies of their own. Indeed, when a Hungarian nobleman by the unlikely name of Pulski visited Boston in 1852, he looked around and marveled at what the city's leadership elite had accomplished. Look, hospitals, asylums, charitable institutions, philanthropies, lectures, athenaeums. Oh, He says, Boston is for America what the court of Weimar once was for Germany, the center of literature and science. What Polsky didn't get, however, I think, was that Boston's civic leadership was different from that of Europe, at least, in my opinion, in two respects. First of all, its ranks were not confined to academic scholars, although certainly the great poets and writers and philosophers and historians of that day, and again, one of the things that always fascinated me when I taught this as a general course, when you line them all up, think of it. Emerson, Longfellow, Thoreau, Whittier, Hawthorne, Tickner, Holmes, all at the same time, all on the same stage, and they knew one another. They went to school together. Clearly, these people were a very, very important part of the group. But the leadership elite brought form and organization to all of this. And that leadership also consisted of physicians and lawyers and ministers and bankers and politicians and businessmen who were intent on, first of all, learning everything they could themselves about all of the exciting new literary and scientific movements that were going on during this period of time. In 1846, for example, Dr. John Collins Warren, that same physician, now a little bit older, brought together a group of what he called congenial gentlemen and formed the Thursday Evening Club, composed of, now, their names are not as important as their occupations. That's the point. There was Francis Gray, who was a lawyer, Martin Brimmer, an immigrant from Bavaria who is now a wealthy philanthropist in the city, Abbott Lawrence, who was a great textile magnate of the period, George Darracott, who was a successful business agent, Dr. Charles Jackson, a physician, Dr. August Gould, another physician, who was also an expert on seashells. He was a conchologist, not an oncologist. Well, this group met together, had dinner, and then they voted to extend invitations to William Appleton, who had been in the textile business, who was now a Whig congressman, a Dr. Vinton, an Episcopalian clergyman. And interestingly enough, for this particular period, the Reverend John Bernard Fitzpatrick, who was the Roman Catholic Bishop of Boston. But more important, a graduate of the Boston Latin School. And it was that got him in the club, because he was considered to be a cultured gentleman, despite the fact he was a papist. But after dinner, these gentlemen would sit around and listen to all kinds of authorities who would come in and talk about all kinds of new ideas and new developments that were going on during the day. And they would give a talk on just at random telegraphy, architecture, zoology, maritime law, anesthesia. As a matter of fact, one night they subjected each other to some of this, and you can see these gentlemen in a woozy state all night long. And a newfangled fire alarm system that was operated by something called electromagnetism, which they found fascinating. So my point is, the occupational diversity of Boston's leadership at this time was really something to behold, and in sharp contrast to that of Europe. But in addition to its diversity, there was also a second difference in Boston's leadership elite. Unlike many of their European counterparts, most members had little interest in remaining separate and apart from the general population. They didn't want to be a separate class or caste. They were not satisfied merely with raising their own intellectual standards or those of their own circle of upper-class, well-placed, highly educated friends and colleagues. They wanted all Bostonians to know what they knew, what they found out, to share with all Bostonians the knowledge of new ideas and new information. Boston, all New England respected learning. Van Wyck Brooks has written in his wonderful book called The Flowering of New England. No New England boy was allowed even to question that he was destined to succeed in life, provided that he knew enough. And with this perfectionist ideal in mind, Boston's civic leaders were absolutely determined that every person, every boy, every girl, every man, every woman, even those who occupied the lowest rungs of the city's socioeconomic ladder, and yes, even those with physical and mental disabilities, as witnessed by the work of Samuel Gridley Howe at this moment at the Perkins Institute for the Blind. Everybody should have as much useful knowledge as possible so they could raise themselves up and improve the quality of their lives. And once again, the collective efforts of Boston's leadership elite became an active force. I mean, these things just didn't happen. Somebody was moving them. And they were moving in them by promoting every type of knowledge in every form possible to all the citizens of the city. The top people, Edward Everett, for example, together with Daniel Webster and Nathan Hale, created, and this is the title I love most, an organization known as the Useful Knowledge Society. And before long, other groups, such as the Boston Lyceum, the Mercantile Library Association, the Merchants Association, were formed to emphasize the importance of self-education and to promote what became known as the lecture habit as a noteworthy feature of Boston society. You people have it. Yeah. But visitors to Boston during this period of time commented frequently. You say, I've been to Boston, what was it like there? They're running in every which way direction. They're going off to a lecture somewhere, back and forth. In 1836, John Lowell Jr., son of Francis Cabot Lowell, a great textile manufacturer, founded what became known as the Lowell Institute, that offered free lectures on science and religion and history and literature. And according to one observer, as many as 8,000 people applied for tickets by such prominent scholars, the top people. Benjamin Silliman of Yale, for example, speaking on chemistry. James Russell Lowell of Harvard, talking about poetry. Or Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, very often spoke on any subject they wanted. And the people didn't mind. They didn't care. They just wanted to come and listen to them speak, the great men. In his boyhood reminiscences, Edward Everett Hale, some of you may know him by the statue just across Charles Street as you leave the public garden, as you leave the common. You cross Charles Street and enter the public gardens. There's an old gentleman just walking in. And he's leaning, bearded, he's leaning on heavily on a cane with his hat in his hand. Well, that's when he was an old man. But in talking about his life in Boston as a young man, he remembered meeting with his friends at these lecture halls, listening to the lectures, walking home with a group afterwards, and very often ending up at somebody's house where dishes of oysters and crackers and cheese were generally available. It was not only an intellectual occasion for these people, it was a social event, and they enjoyed it. But this stimulation of the thirst for knowledge, this desire for even more knowledge, and the excitement of intellectual curiosity inevitably led to other reforms that further advanced Boston's claim to the title of the Athens of America. I mean, once you start some of these things, you can't stop them. One was the necessity of providing all of those people who came to attend all those public lectures and seminars with books. They had to have books, lots of books. And when it became evident that ordinary working people could not afford the cost either of purchasing books outright or subscribing to one of the private literary reading rooms, then it became obvious that a public library had to be built. It's obvious. That was the only solution. They tried for a period of time to get some of the private libraries to come together. And would they allow their books to be loaned? And basically, they were not having the unwashed, either going into their institutions or handling their books. And so therefore, it became obvious that a new institution had to be built. And again, largely through the efforts of leaders in Boston, George Tickner, very, very well-known Harvard professor of languages, and the very, very eminent statesman, Edward Everett. Through their efforts, the Boston Public Library was founded, announcing that this new institution, as you will find it today in its structure in Copley Square, has blown over the entrance the words, "free to all." Free to all. And in the light of this historical context, those words, you see, have a special meaning, a special significance. For in Boston, knowledge itself, as well as the books, was meant to be free to all. And of course, once people were excited about lectures and scholars and books and libraries, it was inevitable that they would have to think about the condition of the schools. I mean, what if the people can't read these books? What if they want to read more? By this time, it had become obvious that the prevailing system of common schools, with their little red schoolhouses and ungraded classes and untrained teachers, was simply no longer suited to the social and economic conditions of what was obviously a growing urban community. An urban community like Boston, whose population had gone from some 43,000 in 1820 to over 175,000 in 1850. It was, as many of you know, a former lawyer and a politician by the name of Horace Mann, after he became the first Secretary of State of the Board of Education, who transformed what was really a moribund and truly haphazard system of education by what? Training teachers, beginning the process of professionalization of teaching, creating new schools, increasing the numbers of them, putting students in graded classes, so that in a single class you would not have students running in one sitting from 6 to 16. By increasing appropriations and by devising and developing a standardized curricula and standardized textbooks throughout the system, which was vital for a population which was mobile, always moving, expanding, and so forth, even within the course of a single year. And for a student to go from one area, one school, to another school, so forth, with no standardized curriculum was absolutely terrible. This was one of the truly remarkable number of reform movements of the period that would mark Boston as one of the leading cities in the nation, largely as the result of the efforts of an enterprising elite that saw the welfare of the city and the responsibility of a broad community effort. Now, just jumping a little bit beyond the period covered in the book, I would be remiss if I did not point out that this sense of public stewardship on the part of prominent business leaders in the city didn't stop with the 19th century in Boston. When Henry Lee Higginson, for example, who was a banker, one of the leading bankers in the city, thought that Boston had grown important enough to have a symphony orchestra, he bought one. At least he went out and he provided the funds to assemble some of the finest musicians of the period. And later, when he found that there was no place for these people to play, he provided the funds to construct the Boston Symphony Hall. When Boston needed an opera house, there's a man by the name of Eben Jordan, the head of Jordan Marsh department store, who constructed the beautiful Boston Opera House on Huntington Avenue, that now is no more, but in its day was a jewel. And later, he gave a large auditorium, Jordan Hall, to the New England Conservatory of Music. And it was Ralph Lowell, chairman of the Boston Safe Deposit and Trust Company, who paved the way for public television, the greater Boston area. A member of the Harvard Board of Overseers, president of the Museum of Fine Arts, Mr. Lowell was on the board of at least 6 hospitals and 12 welfare associations, popularly known as, in his day, Mr. Boston. Ralph Lowell also served as the chairman of a group known, and some of you will recall it, the Vault, a collection of leading Boston businessmen, bankers, and financiers who formed their own organization in an effort to stabilize the economy of the city. They called themselves the Boston Coordinating Committee. It was a much more conservative term. But they met regularly downstairs in the basement of Ralph Lowell's bank, the Boston Safe Deposit and Trust Company, and they met in an area that had once been the large bank vault, but was no longer used for that. It was used for a conference room. But of course, once the reporters got wise, they were known collectively as the Vault. They never really liked that. But they worked with Mayor John Collins very, very closely during the years of urban renewal and proved that political leaders and business leaders could talk to one another in Boston without a major disaster. But these men and the men that I've talked about previously were men who lived in Boston, who had grown up in Boston, whose businesses were located in Boston, and who assumed a serious personal responsibility for the social and the cultural and the intellectual welfare of their community. As I mentioned earlier, they not only contributed their money, but they gave generously of their time and their talents and their concerns in establishing and maintaining those institutions that gave Boston its reputation as the Athens of America. But the days of the China trade are over. The textile and leather industries have gone away. The railroads have stopped running. And the vault no longer exists. It went out of existence. Jordan Marsh and Fellines have disappeared. The Boston Globe is owned by the New York Times. John Hancock went off, I think, to Toronto. And only recently, the famous Boston publication called the Atlantic Monthly went off to Washington, a great loss to the city. And as I read about the companies and the businesses that are leaving Boston, with their presidents and directors and CEOs residing in New York, or London, or Singapore, or Tokyo, I must say, I wonder who now will be regarded as the treasurers of God's bounty in Boston? Who will serve as the trustees of the city? Who will become the directors of hospitals, sit on the boards of museums, subscribe to the symphony, monitor the charitable and the welfare centers of the Commonwealth? Who will serve as the new leadership elite in shaping the future of the city in which their companies operate and from which they will draw their workers? These are the type of questions that prompted my thoughts and reflections about a time in our history when Boston had great pride in its past, and even at that time, greater hopes for its future. And so those are my reflections. I can leave those with you for your reflection. Thank you very much.
Would you be willing to take a few questions?
Of course.
Please.
As long as they're civil.
Well, they're likely to be.
Yes, sir.
Leave me worried that perhaps someone in Singapore might buy the Boston Red Sox.
Stranger things have happened, I guess. Yeah. Well, the Yankees hired, bought Babe Ruth, didn't they? So, anybody else?
If I might, you leave me a little bit concerned, to say the
Oh.
least. What hope do you see and what hope do you have? What new model do you see for
Yeah.
leadership in a provincial city
Well,
like
well, this,
Boston?
well, we can't do it the old way. That can't be done. But where would you draw? Again, you can't draw from the textile industry or maritime activities. But it seems to me that there are in Boston various, I don't know what to call, culture groups from which leaders could be drawn. And if they could be, enough of them could be drawn to form, I suppose, what today would be maybe known as a think tank for Boston. I mean, for example, think of the clusters we have here. One of them are the universities. In other words, per square inch, I don't know of an area with more colleges and universities, for example. They work for themselves, they think for themselves, and so forth. What about, again, the community? What about their effort here? If we get a representative from that group. It seems to me the medical and dental groups in Boston are some of the largest and greatest in the nation. If we have a representative from there. The high-tech and biochemical groups, for example, must generate some kind of interest and be concerned about the type of high-tech workers that they're going to need in the future. In addition to those, which would be obviously social and educational and academic, you would have social active groups, for example. In other words, I could maybe conceive of, if not a new vault, at least maybe a new leadership elite that would gather together periodically, meet together, dine together if you like, but have, for example, when we have, let's say, academic conferences now, professional conferences now, generally what they're talking about is their own profession. You go to one of these conferences and the doctors are meeting, for example, and they're talking about new medical techniques or new cardiovascular discoveries and so forth. How does this relate to the community? Or how does the community relate to it? how does what they're doing, for example, in the medical field, relate to what that's being done at the same time in the pharmaceutical field? And how does this relate to so forth? Are there any organizations that do that at the present time? Could Boston create a new type of leadership elite for the 21st century that would model itself a little bit along the lines of the leadership elite of the 19th century in terms of, we know what we're doing, we're satisfied with our status here, but what could we do, for example, to contribute to the health and the welfare and the cultural and the social development of the community at large? So I think that that's one direction that people could think about when they read history. Yes, ma'am?
Do you think that part of what's missing is a public appreciation for general knowledge in an age where everything is so specialized, when kids have to pick double majors and get MAs just to have a particular profession? Is this idea, I mean, it really stood out for me in listening to you talk, that this appetite for general knowledge, just learning to learn for your own enjoyment and benefit, rather than because you're going to go turn it into a job or you're going to turn it into something else. Is there a way to bring that back, do you think?
Well, again, we might look at the kind of education that these people had. Now, again, when you go over the names of these people, most of them were educated. I mean, we talk about leadership elite, and again, I'm not saying we have to duplicate that at the present time, but this leadership elite was drawn from the higher social echelons of Boston. These were people of background, breeding, education, experience, and so forth. Almost all of them that I can think of just offhand were Harvard graduates. I mean, 90%. But in those days, there was no graduate education. That is, these men received Harvard education, which at that time was a basic, liberal arts education. Anything beyond that, they learned on their own. But the design of the education was to educate them in such a way that they would be capable of, thinking beyond the box. They'd be capable of independent thinking, capable of reasoning properly. They're subjected to philosophy and theology, for example. In the classical tradition. So these were generalists. They were generalists, but they were educated, with the idea that the kind of broad, general, again, I would refer to as liberal arts education they received would fit them to be the leaders of the future. I mean, they often maintain that Harvard, for example, was designed to turn out ministers, which, of course, was one of their primary objectives. As they said, when those among us shall lie in the soil, they needed educated and learned ministers for the future. But they were also educating people the way in which Cambridge University would have educated them back in England, in broad, so they would become the leaders of the future, the leaders of government, the leaders of business, because they had the type of thinking capacity to do that. So, among other things, I think this is what Boston College does very well. In my opinion, providing a broad education with a basic core curriculum that whatever your particular specialty would be, somewhere along the line, you're going to be introduced to good thinking and good reasoning. So, yes.
Since I moved to town in '98, perhaps the most interesting, enduring conversation is the idea of a new Boston, a more worldly, a cosmopolitan, a kind of different Boston. It seems in Athens of America, in some ways, you're describing perhaps the first new Boston, a worldly city that is engaged in different ways. And a good number of your earlier books detail the kind of parochial heritage of Boston, various aspects of local parochialism. I'm wondering how you would describe the relationship between that kind of enduring parochialism that will always characterize Boston and these more worldly, more open to a cosmopolitan approach to engagements, whether the China trade, influences from European culture. It's not as though one side or the other ever wins out, but how would you describe that kind of relationship?
Well, it's a pendulum relationship in a way, and I you had the experience in writing books that you finish the book, and then at some time later you read back on it, and you see things that you didn't see at the first time. And one of the things that I got from this book is that, I guess in a way what you're saying, nothing changes that much. That is, we all think we live at a particular, right now. You say, these things have never happened before. Isn't this strange? Isn't this odd? Take a look at what's going on. I mean, for example, you talk about blue states and red states, and you think that's new now? You know, if Boston doesn't come out as a blue state during this period of time, at the end, I have a chapter actually in which a man with a name that you know very well, Frederick Law Olmsted, who became the city planner for Boston after the Civil War. But as still a young man, he was sent into the South to tour the South and make reports back to the New York Tribune. And where Boston thought it was doing so well, and where obviously what Boston was doing should become the model for the rest of the country. You know, you should have heard what the South was saying. Can you imagine what I talked about this evening? Can you imagine Southerners talking to this Northerner coming down, interviewing them, and among other things, would you like to be like that? Temperance? You ain't going to drink anymore? Coddling criminals? Prison discipline society? What's this? You know, rehabilitation? For what? I mean, they never did anything for us and so forth. Letting women into organizations. Men, this phrase that I use, and I just love it when I read it, they refer to what was going on in New England by long-haired men and short-haired women. You know? You want us to be industrialized? We love it here. The green fields and fresh waters. We don't, and let all those immigrants in. We're talking about 1840s now, 1830s, 1840s. We don't want any of that in the South. I mean, you know, the Athens of America might have been a model here, but I can assure you, in the South and in the frontier West, it was not, and they were having none of it. So this contrast between these social and civic ideals, for example, is nothing new. And the other thing, we hear the battles about, for example, creationism, intelligent design, evolution, and so forth. You think that's new? For example, that's what they were arguing about in the early 1800s here in Boston, between the great fight between the Congregationalists with their fundamentalist Calvinistic view of man, of God, of salvation, and the new coming of Unitarianism, which becomes what many people in other parts of the country refer to as the Boston religion, as it was influenced by the Newtonian and scientific revolution of reason and rationality. And we're discussing the fact that God was not judgmental and wrathful, but beneficent. God loves us. And people, man, was not a degraded creature. All men were brothers. They should live in harmony with one another. And salvation, remember the Calvinistic approach of predestination? God designed some people for heaven and everybody else went to hell. And the Unitarians were saying, it's up to you. Salvation is available to everybody. It depends upon what you do, how you behave, how you treat your brother. Well, which is it? I mean, this was a theological and philosophical conflict that went on for many years. So, again, I think these things simply go back and forth in Boston history, depending on where the emphasis is at the particular time. Yes, ma'am.
I'm intrigued by your
Oh, good.
your description of what was it called, the Thursday Evening Club.
Yes.
Where all these gentlemen from different disciplines tried out ether.
Yes.
What's the sort of, where can I read more about that? That's very interesting.
I found it in a history of the Boston Thursday Evening Club. There's a little history, and I found it in the Boston Athenaeum. I don't know whether it's in other libraries, but there's a little history about that.
Something to try and picture.
I know all of these conservative gentlemen trying a little whiff of ether, yeah, and getting a high on, yeah. Yes.
I grew up in Newton, and I went away to school in New York, came back, and about 20 years ago I was a student of yours at one point. And you instilled in me a pride for Boston and the area that I'd always had, but you really still do. My question is, the leadership, I feel that Boston is still vibrant, even more vibrant than it was 20, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And also the whole region, 495 region and beyond. And I assume you're including the outskirts of Boston.
Yes, yeah, it's,
So it seems that I think there's still leaders here. They're certainly in college level, with the universities and so forth, and new leaders coming in, biotech industry and so forth.
right.
So do you have an optimistic viewpoint of the 21st century for leadership in Boston?
Yes, I'm an optimist by nature, yeah. No, I think, and as you say, that there are leaders, but it's almost a question of corralling them. You see, again, the point of this book is that you say, well, gee, all of these things, this is marvelous, all of these things are happening all at once and so forth, but they didn't, quote, just happen. I mean, I don't think things happen that way. I think, and this leadership elite sort of didn't, I mean, they didn't bring these writers and poets in. I mean, they were there. But they made them part of the community culture. I mean, they could have stayed off over in Cambridge and meet together in the Old Corner bookstore and so forth and had no connection with the people. But they were given a venue. They were given an approach that I guess any academic person would love to get by saying, how would you like to talk to thousands of people? Say, great. And they were very, very interested in doing that. And as I say, in many cases, they would talk about their specialty, but in many other cases, if they read the morning newspaper and there was a war in Mexico and they wanted to talk about it, that's what they would talk about. But again, somebody created the venue. Somebody established sort of the organizational boundaries for this. See, because people can say to me, well, they were doing similar things in Philadelphia and New York during this period of time, which they were. In Philadelphia, for example, they too were experimenting with new designs for prisons. In New York, they were also designing, for example, one that would be called the Auburn system that would be used at Sing Sing, of multiple cells and so forth. And they were creating new waterworks in these places and so forth. So the things themselves weren't unusually new. But it seems to me that what was distinctive about it was that these things happened within a framework. That these were not only things in themselves, but they contributed to this larger sense that Boston was different. And it was different because they were thinking of the community as a whole. So, yeah. Okay? Thank you.